Where is the church today? Have we been influenced by culture, or are we influencing culture? To investigate these questions, let's turn our attention to Google's Ngram Viewer website. If you haven't heard of this wonderful tool, let me give you a very quick introduction. If you want more information, there are plenty of places that you can learn more about it, such as other YouTube videos. Google has scanned millions of books in multiple languages from the past several centuries. From these books, Google has been able to compile information about how frequently individual words and phrases get used within these books. This provides us with a very accurate means by which we can understand how our language, and by extension our priorities and perspectives, have changed over time. When you open Google Ngram Viewer, it shows you how frequently the names of Albert Einstein, Sherlock Holmes, and Frankenstein have been used in English literature over the years. Not surprisingly, the phrase Albert Einstein was not used prior to the life of Albert Einstein, and Sherlock Holmes was never mentioned before Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote about him. I'm not sure Einstein would be too thrilled to know that people have always been more interested in discussing Frankenstein than they have been in discussing him, except for a brief period of time around 1960. As this chart shows, the use of certain words remains relatively steady over time. Not surprisingly, the number 3 doesn't really rise or fall in popularity, nor does the word air, other than a small bump around 1940, which we'll look at in a minute, or the words wonder or ship when used as a noun. However, it can be a little difficult to compare trends between different words if some are more common than others. 3 is much more common than ship. This is especially true when comparing individual words to phrases, because any phrase is vastly less probable than an individual word because there are so many different ways of combining words into phrases. But we have the option of multiplying words and phrases to make trends easier to compare, like this. As you can see in this chart, there is some volatility in the use of the word ship, even though in the long run it does remain relatively steady. But notice how something interesting happened around 1940. Both ship and air see a short-term increase in usage in the literature. Is there a connection? Here are a few more words that saw increased usage around that time. This makes the correlation a little more intuitive. The rise in use of these words was associated with World War II. For instance, as an aviation buff, I can say that the role of airplanes in the military really took off during that time as the military strategists of the world finally figured out how these wing contraptions could contribute to their operations. This is why we see a short-term increase in the use of some words around 1940. There was a world war underway. And this chart illustrates why sometimes we need to multiply certain words or phrases in order to see if the rise and fall in their usage is related to some other word or phrase. Typically, the more words in the phrase, the greater the multiplication factor. It's just how the math works. Enough background. Let's explore some of the longer-term cultural changes that have been taking place. This next chart shows a bunch of words that we have slowly used less and less. Well, this is a little disturbing if you think about it. Over the past 2 centuries, we have become less and less likely to talk about virtues or duties. We are less concerned about our character and our dignity. We spend less time talking about honor and nobility. These words, which are rich in human depth, have become less and less a part of our vocabulary. So what have we been talking about then? Well, apparently we are very interested in ourselves as individuals. We want to talk about our health and our rights. And as something of a latecomer to the conversation, wellness has become a significant priority for us, something we discuss more now than we did before. In fact, the word seems to have popped into existence only decades ago. Interestingly, we find that during the past couple of centuries, quite a few words seem to have popped into existence out of nowhere or suddenly become explosively more common than they previously were. It would seem we have become far more social creatures. We are more likely to talk about community and relationships with others, but not just any relationships, it would seem. Our sexuality has become increasingly more interesting to us. We seem to talk about it a lot. In fact, the subject of sex is more popular than a lot of other things we often talk about. Just a quick note here. None of these words have been scaled up, so we are comparing apples to apples. And the word all in brackets means that the chart includes all uses of the word, whether it is capitalized or not. What does this tell us? We have become more interested in talking about sex than talking about our hobbies and games, our coffee and beer. Yes, even beer if you can believe that. Our favorite animals, like dogs and horses, have had to settle for playing second fiddle. In fact, the horse used to be one of the foundations upon which civilization was built until the Industrial Revolution replaced it with machines. Yet the frequency with which we speak about sex today is almost on par with how often we used to speak about horses. Has sex really become that important to us? Is it really as important to us as the very foundations of our civilization? It would seem it has. Today we talk about sex more than we talk about social issues like poverty and democracy. Even our duties have taken a back seat to the subject of sex. In fact, even such influential technologies as the internet and car, our modern day equivalent of the horse perhaps, are roughly as popular to discuss as sex. Only the car seems to hold a lead over sex. At the same time as sex has become a significant focus for English-speaking authors, some other trends are also worth exploring. We have become very interested in discussing things of a physical nature, though we should be careful because physical is one of those words with a wide plethora of meanings. We are more interested in experiences as well as image and stylish things. Along a seemingly related lines, the reality of narcissism is much more commonly discussed than it used to be. Perhaps because we are increasingly concerned with our own physical image, our style. We also seem to be increasingly interested in the here and now. Let's focus in a little on concepts related to the word stylish. It would seem we are very interested in whatever is current, contemporary, stylish, trendy, and relevant, far more interested than we used to be. But back to the central issue of this video. Is the church being influenced by culture, or is the church influencing culture? Well, let's backtrack a little. Remember how I mentioned that we have spoken less and less about honor, virtue, and all that? Well, as this chart shows, at about the same rate as we stop talking about those things, we also stop talking about sin and repentance. Style has become very important to our culture, as is shown in the rise of phrases such as writing style, music style, and clothing style, for example. Sometime after these phrases hit the mainstream, the concept of worship style suddenly became a topic of conversation. Our culture has slowly but steadily become increasingly interested in experiences, and sometime around the 1960s, a certain type of experience associated with heroin, marijuana, and LSD really caught people's interest. At almost the exact same time in history, around 1960, the concept of experiencing God began to show up in popular usage, though at a much slower rate. People have grown increasingly concerned about being relevant, starting around 1920. At around the same time, people also started talking more about the relevance of Christianity, and we started wringing our hands about how to make Christianity relevant. Even today, we have a Christian magazine entitled, quite simply and not so subtly, Relevant Magazine, which was launched in 2002. And like our present culture, the church seems to frequently get caught up in whatever is the latest and greatest fad, whether it is worship styles, evangelism techniques, or what have you. Just as the culture around us is increasingly concerned with whatever is contemporary and current, many churches have traditional worship services and, you guessed it, contemporary worship services, a concept that only started taking off around 1990, well after the word contemporary became significantly more common in our cultural language. All of this might make you wonder, has the essence of the gospel changed? Well, here are a few other interesting correlations for you to ponder. Our culture began showing increasing interest in talking about our identity sometime around 1950, and lo and behold, the phrase identity in Christ started showing up a couple of decades later. The concept seems to have become central to our understanding of the faith, though it hardly existed before about 1970. Culture started placing significantly more emphasis on relationship in the early part of the 20th century, and the church began describing Christianity with the phrases relationship with Jesus and relationship with God around the 1960s. Before that time, both of those phrases were virtually never used. But when culture talks about relationship, what exactly do they mean? As this chart shows, culture grew increasingly interested in all kinds of relationships in the early part of the last century. But you'll notice which kind of relationship seemed to get the most attention. Again, in this chart, none of the lines have been scaled. We're comparing apples to apples. Once again, we're talking about sex. But what happens when we superimpose the phrase sexual relationship with these fairly recent descriptions of what Christianity is supposedly all about? The phrase sexual relationship started showing up around 1900, and it really took off during the 1960s. Similarly, the phrase personal relationship with Jesus follows almost exactly the same pattern, and the assertion that Christianity is a relationship followed a similar pattern, though its early history is a little more hit and miss. Could it be that we have somehow, probably inadvertently and quite unintentionally, altered the very core of our understanding of the gospel in the shadow of the sexual revolution? While I am very reluctant to firmly declare that there is a causal relationship between these two, the coincidence seems too striking to simply dismiss. Instead of drawing sweeping conclusions from all this information on all these charts, let me give you just two firm conclusions that I think we can draw from all this data, and I'll leave the interpretation to you. First, the language of our church has changed a lot. After 2,000 years of existence, we seem to have suddenly embraced a whole new dictionary to describe some very key elements of our faith. Is this good or bad? Are we correcting oversights of the past, or are we making brand new mistakes? I leave that to you to reflect on. Second, the changes we have made to our church lingo occurred in close temporal proximity to some very radical changes that have occurred in our mainstream Western culture. And the language changes and culture seem conspicuously similar to the language changes we have made in the church. Are we responding to culture or being led by it? Again, how to interpret that is an exercise I leave to you. But the fact that our language of faith is utterly different from those who have gone before us for roughly 2 millennia, the fact that it changed virtually overnight, and that it changed around the same time that our broader culture experienced a cataclysmic series of changes, should inspire us to ask some hard questions.